I'm sure you're all looking forward to hearing him speak as much as I am, so would you please welcome our special guest, Mr. Bob Carr.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've got a lot of time for librarians because when I was Premier, they helped me put together something called the Premier's Reading Challenge. They picked the books that went out to the primary schools and the high schools of New South Wales and enabled youngsters to read, to devour great lists of books. It's terrific. I felt I had the young people of New South Wales reading as never before, and librarians helped make that a reality. And youngsters came to their libraries because that had a great boost to their literacy at school. So it's wonderful to be in a library, especially one as good as this. I wrote the book because I like history. I enjoy reading history. I'm fascinated by history. I like American history, yes, Australian history, history of the Roman Empire. I'm trying to read myself into Chinese history. I like history. So if you've had the opportunity to participate in history, I think you've got an obligation to write it down so that years from now, Australians, general readers, citizens, scholars who want to know what it was like to be making decisions for Australia can go to a book. What sort of book? Well, I'm trying to read not Julia Gillard's, Hillary Clinton, another great woman, memoir at the present time. I like Hillary Clinton. I make it very clear in my diary. I admire Hillary Clinton. I've got fond references to her. After one meeting, I say, any meeting with Hillary is pure champagne. I think she'll be an excellent president. I think she's superbly well qualified after 4 years as Secretary of State to be a very good president. But between you and me, the memoir is hard going. It's a big fat book, big serious chapters, one after the other, China, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all the rest. I tried a different sort of book. What would it be like to give a day-to-day account, to record dealing with colleagues when you're in a bad mood or they're in grumpy moods? Record what it's like to arrive in a place with no sleep, time change, jet lag, and have to give a speech. To record what it's like to give a speech in a marquee by the East River, next to the United Nations building, where all the diplomats you're trying to impress, while you're speaking, go on talking to one another. And in my case, I left the platform thinking that's gone over like a lead balloon. None of them are going to vote for Australia in the ballot for the Security Council. None of them were treating me with the faintest respect. Meanwhile, we've got Finland over there, our competitor, looking very complacent about how the ballot will go for them in a couple of days' time. This is a real gritty life. It's being forced to exist, after being forced to fly into Paris, go to the hotel and change, and then go to a meeting with the Minister for Overseas Aid, and then to a meeting with the Foreign Minister, and then at the end of that meeting to get in a car and head to the airport to fly to Geneva to do it all over again. I thought it's time for an honest diary of an Australian Foreign Minister that tells the Australian people what it's like to make policy on their behalf. I record walking in and sitting down with the Chinese Foreign Minister at my first meeting in Beijing after I took over, and to have him, Foreign Minister Young, sternly set me straight about what he described as the tightening of Cold War alliances in the region, by which he meant Australia agreeing to have Marines rotated, American Marines rotated through the Northern Territory. China didn't like it. He let me know China didn't like it. And to have Chinese foreign investment in Australia blocked, by which he meant Huawei, a Chinese company with close links with the Chinese leadership, supply equipment to our national broadband network. And I thought, I must explain to him that Australia has always supported a treaty with the United States. I'll explain why. And I'll explain that every country has got the necessity of making decisions about the security and resilience of its national broadband network. And here I was a few weeks into the job, feeling for the first time that I was speaking for Australia. I was representing Australia. I was explaining Australian attitudes and Australian interests. And whenever I did this, it was a very great honour to be chosen to speak for your country, to explain your country's position. The biggest failure, and I admit to it, was the tragedy of Syria. In her book, Hillary Clinton calls Syria a devilish problem, and it was a tragedy. And the tragedy is continuing. Is there anyone here tonight from the region, from Syria or Jordan, from Palestine? What country? Lebanon. Well, there's Lebanon being terribly affected. In Lebanon, I went to not refugee camps, they were smaller, they were settlements, where people from Syria, some of them who'd arrived the previous night, were gathered. The Lebanese people were very hospitable to them. They wouldn't have survived, and the Lebanese school system had terrible pressure because of the big increase in Syrian youngsters who wanted to have schooling, not knowing how long they'll be living in Lebanon. Their homes had been destroyed, their possessions, cows, car, destroyed. In some cases, children fled on their own. A mother fled on her own to get over, in the dead of night, to get over the Syrian border into Lebanon or into Jordan or into Turkey. This is a terrible tragedy. The housing's being destroyed, youngsters are losing their lives, and only recently we heard that polio had emerged again in Syria. Polio, which we thought had been exterminated. So here are youngsters waking up one morning paralysed. Legs don't move, arms don't move, they've got polio because vaccines can't get into the country, they can't get medicines in the country. In my naivety, I conceived a plan that would see us get the different militias and the armies to get together and to agree that medical convoys could get across the border, for example, from Lebanon into Syria, and to move between the different zones without being attacked. The doctors and nurses would not be attacked. Hospitals would not be targeted. Hospitals would not be used as bases. If you can't get an agreement to stop the fighting, and if you can't get an agreement to have a peaceful election in the country, at least we can get agreement. At least we can get agreement to get medicines in there and to see that the wounded are looked after, and people who need normal medical care, tablets for heart disease, vaccinations against polio, can at least get this. I saw a terribly sad thing that moved me very much on BBC TV during the time I was minister. It was a boy, say about 11 years of age, who was being lowered onto a makeshift hospital bed. There'd been a bomb, a petrol bomb, go off in a schoolyard, and he was one of the victims. And in Arabic, he was saying, and I thought it was terrible to hear these words in translation. Why do they do it here? Why do they do it there when they're only hurting us? And here was a boy asking the question, why do they, this impersonal they, do it? That is, plant a petrol bomb in a schoolyard when it can only hurt children like him. This is a war against children. It's a war that's demolishing housing. You've seen the photos of the footage. The streets of Syrian cities where the apartment block after apartment block is just wrecked. And you've got millions of refugees, a huge burden on Jordan, on Lebanon, and on Turkey. This is a huge tragedy, but I made no progress. At all the meetings I had, I raised the need for an agreement to get medicines into the country, and foreign ministers agreed it was a good thing, we should be doing it, but there was a terrible inertia about the United Nations machinery. And the Syrian regime enjoyed the strong support of Russia, so Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia was never prepared to engage about this. He was just simply defending Assad, and he saw this as what I was proposing as intervention, when our only response should be to join with Assad and support Assad. It's a sobering reminder that while we all accept the need of the world to respond and protect a population at risk, sometimes it's very hard to make this happen in practice. Very hard. In the book, I give an account of one big disagreement I had with Julia Gillard. I admired her as a Prime Minister. I was very much in her camp. The questions about Palestinian status. There was a motion in the UN that would give the Palestinian delegation not the status of a country, but somewhat enhanced status akin to that the Vatican enjoys in the General Assembly. And I was in favour of Australia not blocking it, ideally to vote yes, at least to abstain. And we had a disagreement, because time and time again I found that Julia, while we were in agreement with everything else, I got to say, was wedded to the most rigid pro-Israeli position. So I found that when I wanted to get out a statement criticising another burst of Israeli settlement construction on the West Bank, she prevented me doing it. And I strongly disagreed with this. When there's a dispute, a vote in the UN, in a dispute between Lebanon and Israel over responsibility for an oil spill, I wanted to vote with Lebanon, because Lebanon was in the right. The Israelis had bombed a power station. It had caused an oil spill, and the Israelis were responsible. It had nothing to do with Israeli security. It's just that the correct position for Australia to take when it came up for a vote in the General Assembly was to vote with Lebanon, a country with which we've got friendly relations. There's a huge Lebanese population in Australia. And I promised their foreign minister that we would vote with him on the merits of the case. So I reproduce in my book the text messages exchanged between me and my Prime Minister, where I stated my position, she stated hers. It went backwards and forwards. In the end, the Prime Minister wins. But when, at the end of this process, the question came of how we vote at the UN on Palestinian status, I was boiling hot. After these other setbacks, I was determined to win. Most of the Cabinet agreed with me. At one meeting, 10 members of the Cabinet spoke up in favour of my position, that is, on how Australia should vote on the Palestinians at the General Assembly, and only 2 spoke out in support of her position. I tell the story in the book. So I was at odds with my Prime Minister, clear difference. It's interesting how it works. She says, well, I've listened to the views around the table. On the bottom line, I get to make the decision. It's a strange convention. As Premier, if I'd had about 18 members of the Cabinet against me and only 2 speaking for me, I think I would have said something diplomatic like, we might have another look at this. I'll pull this, I'll take this item off the agenda and we'll think about it over the next couple of weeks. But Julia, as on all matters affecting Israel, was very, very firm. But in the end, and this is where your local members of Parliament are important, in the end, the next day there was a meeting, not just of the Cabinet, but the whole parliamentary party, what we call the caucus. And someone, Andrew Lee, the member for Canberra in the Parliament, had tabled a motion that we support the Palestinians. And that would have been carried. That would have been carried across the factions, across all the different state representations. There's enough support for it to get it carried. And Julia did, at that point, what a smart leader of a government does, listen to the party and adjust one's position accordingly. She changed her position at that last moment. And someone said to me, you're putting all this detail in your book. You're sworn to secrecy as a Cabinet member. It's unethical to do this. My response is, I think the Australian people deserve to know how their government works. I think they deserve to know these things. And it doesn't put Julia in a bad light. I'm not saying unfair things about her. I'm just giving an account of how she had a different view from the view I had. And I want I want political scientists, I want students of politics, I want citizens to understand how this gets resolved. And I want people with an interest in this debate, the pro-Israel lobby, the Palestinian community, to understand how these positions were being taken. I think it's important. And by the way, you end up finding out when there's a leak somewhere, and from WikiLeaks or from Edward Snowden, all our secrets get printed anyway, all the cables and the minutes get printed anyway. I just think, someone said to me, oh, the Americans are going to be worried about your book. And I said, the Americans? The Americans? All the Australian secrets that they've thrown sky high because they had no proper security over this classified material back in Washington. For God's sake, tell me the Americans are upset about secrets being exposed. Our secrets with Indonesia were exposed because Edward Snowden, a contractor, was able to look at all those files. A contractor for the National Security Agency was able to look at all those files, have access to them. Do you know the only security the Americans subjected him to? Before he got access, they rang his mother to ask whether he was of good repute. She said, oh, yeah. She probably said, oh, Edward's a wonderful young man. I'm very, very proud of him. And they rang his girlfriend. That was the security. Okay, well, that's fine. He's now got access to all the cables about Australia, and he embarrassed us with Indonesia by revealing that one Australian spy agency, Defence Signals, had collected this sensitive material out of Indonesia. So Indonesia, our relationship with Indonesia has blown up. So Julie Bishop rang me and she said, oh, your book's coming out next week. She said, I'm just concerned. Is it? I said, well, I don't think there's any need to be concerned. I said, I got approval from some of the foreign ministers I dealt with that I can reproduce some of our material. A lot of it is not surprising material, but I think it's stuff the public deserves to know. She said, oh, I'm just worried about what the Americans will make of it. I said, Julia, if anyone in the American embassy or anyone else expresses the slightest criticism of what I've done, this is the argument to make. I've got a very fond view of the United States. The Australian people want a treaty relationship with the United States. They support it. If we didn't have it, we'd probably be looking for it, because promoting our access in Washington is a legitimate goal. And America can do a lot of good in the world, use its power for good. It does look at promoting democracy, and it does look at defending human rights. That's America at its best. But we can say this as loyal friends of America. Every now and then America goes a little strange, as it did under George W. Bush, suddenly discovering that in response to September 11, it would commit to a drawn-out war in Afghanistan. A drawn-out war, not just to take out Al-Qaeda, but to defeat the Taliban, which was a different proposition, and to build a new nation. Well, this was a huge undertaking. And then, in March 2003, to invade Iraq. And my side of politics criticised this decision. Others, John Howard, Tony Blair, encouraged the Bush administration to do it. Look at the results today. Look at the results today. A jihadist group more extreme than Al-Qaeda itself now controls large swathes of territory in Iraq. It is a myth to think that American military intervention can transform the Middle East. There are huge forces at work there, and America is not in a position to have an army on the ground, and its people don't want it to be attempting this anyway. The American people don't want more wars in the Middle East. So the most important narrative in my book is how a foreign minister of Australia in these 18 months dealt with the American relationship and the relationship with China. The story of my disagreement with Julia Gillard is there over Palestine, and Israel is there as well, because it's an interesting case study of what happens behind the cabinet doors, in the party rooms, that you don't get to see. It's more truthful than a memoir, like Hillary's or like other memoirs, because in a memoir every word is considered and everything is designed to make you, the writer, look good, and, in addition to that, to make the past look orderly. To me, public life, like any life, is a welter of confusing and conflicting and overlapping and paradoxical events. All of our lives are a bit of a mess. There are tasks not completed, things forgotten, things remembered, things that dominate your mind, overshadow everything else. Our lives don't go like they're pre-arranged and sorted out. A lot of narratives interacting, overlapping, and certainly that's true of international relations. And the disorder of the process can only be collected, in my view, by a diary. You wake up, there's a disaster hitting you. You go to bed wondering whether things will fall apart the next day. Someone said to me, Graham Richardson was interviewing me on Sky, and he said, I caught you out here, and he said, on such and such a date, he said, you say you're pretty certain that Labor's going to be re-elected and you'll continue to be Foreign Minister. I said, Graham, that's the point of a diary. On that day, I did think that. That morning, the polls were good. Kevin had a good day in the media. Things were going pretty well. Of course, I was wrong. But that becomes clear a few days later when things turn bad. That's the point of a diary. It's got this ragged truthfulness about it. Day by day, up and down. Good days and bad days, like life. As he rendered it, ironed it out to thread it into a memoir, this chapter on China, this chapter on the United States, it looks like it all happened in an orderly fashion. That's not like how life occurs. And remember, my motivation was to capture a bit of history. The book's got a very good run in July Men's Health because it's full of my exercise program and stuff on diet. Everywhere I go, people ask, what are steel-cut oats? So Helena, who knows all about this stuff, wrote me a briefing note. Steel-cut oats have still got the kernel on them. They're not rolled, but they're cut, steel-cut, and as a result, they're said to be more nutritious. They do take longer to heat up, so if you dash and get out of the house, you might want to think about another breakfast cereal alternative, but make it a healthy one. And I think it's a high-stress job, and I knew I was doing a job for Australia, and I sensed it would only be for 18 months. I wanted to do it as well as I could, so I did devote a fair bit of time to keeping fit and healthy. It simply meant I was able to stay awake longer and give more speeches and be alert. When I had some of the meetings were very hard. I recall sitting down with a French minister, not the foreign minister, the Minister for Foreign Aid. I knew he came from the city of Arras, and I knew a bit of French history. I love history. And I said, oh, that's the city of Robespierre. He thought I'd made a reference, my pronunciation must have been atrocious. He thought I'd made a reference to rugby union. So he started talking about rugby union, and I thought, I'll give up at this point, I'll just stick to the script, back to the briefing notes. Back to the briefing notes. So the story's told in that book. I like to think that years from now, someone at a university, a general reader with a keen interest in their country's history, wanting to get a sense of what it was like to be in government, to be sitting down at a cabinet, to be in a government, yes, it was on the slippery slope to extinction, torn apart over leadership, what it was like to make foreign policy for Australia, what it was like to go to Myanmar and say we're lifting sanctions, what it was like to talk about the anxieties of the Japanese. There must be Koreans here tonight. Who we got from Korea? Got any Korean people here tonight? Well, I went to Korea and we had a wonderful meeting with President Park, and it was a result of good Australian diplomacy. When she was in opposition, when she was going nowhere, when she was on the backbench, our embassy decided to invite her to Australia. You look after people when they're down. And then years go by, she's the leader of her party in opposition. And then she becomes president. She's very well disposed towards Australia. My book is a tribute to what is very often good Australian diplomacy, including a good, generous aid program, which I think is important as well. Great honour to have so many of you turn out. All the proceeds of the book go to, I might say, a splendid charity. I'll conclude with this story. I was in a hospital in Vientiane. Anyone from Laos? Hospital from Vientiane. A hospital in Vientiane, the main hospital in Vientiane. And There are some very nervous youngsters there. There's a boy with a cleft palate, a fissure from his upper lip to his nose, and as a result he couldn't speak clearly. There was a girl with burns injuries. She was 13, the boy was 15. Her hand was locked like this, her hand and her arm, because the skin that was burnt when she was young would not close. So it was locked like that. And there were some other burns injuries, other cleft palates, and those youngsters were going in to be operated on by Australian surgeons. It's a charity called Interplast Australia and New Zealand. The kids were very nervous. They were blank-faced. They knew something big was going to happen to them, but they'd never been in a hospital before. So they're going to go in to be operated on, and that afternoon that girl would have a procedure that meant when she went back to her village, she was able to move her hand. And in a village, that might make a big difference to the rest of her life. She might be able to find a husband because she can help in the house or in the fields. And the boy was going to have his face fixed up. He wouldn't speak. It was too late to help him speak normally, but his life would be transformed, and so would the other youngsters. The charity that's doing that is getting all the author proceeds from the book. So they'll be able to perform more operations. My last book had all its proceeds go to Interplast Australia and New Zealand. I was very proud to know that as the book sold, there are going to be more procedures like that being conducted in poor countries in the Pacific and in Asia. By the way, these youngsters in the hospital were so poor that a local Australian charity run by Australian expatriates who live in Vientiane had to raise the money to pay the bus fares so that these kids in need of this desperate operation were able to get from the bush into the city. And then they had to raise money to buy meals so that they could eat while they were in hospital, which is a big reminder that this is a very fortunate country of ours. Yes. We're a very fortunate country compared to the desperately poor countries of the world, and there are a lot of them. So it was a great honour for me, for a mere 18 months, because it was only 18 months, I wanted to capture the experience in a book, a mere 18 months to be its representative overseas, its representative to the world, its salesman, if you like, in these multilateral forums like the UN and the East Asia Summit and all the rest. A very great honour for me, as it is to be here in Campsie Library, in the Canterbury Library in Campsie here tonight. Thank you very much.